Harry is boarding a plane to Britain, alone. No Archie, no Lilibet, no Meghan. A father returning to the country where he was born, where his grandmother is buried, where his bloodline sits on the throne, and he has left his children behind in California because he cannot stand in front of them and guarantee their safety the moment they land. That is not a scheduling conflict. That is not a diary clash. That is a man who has done the calculation, and the calculation came back wrong. And there is no official explanation. That detail alone should stop you cold. Palace sources are not shy about filling silence. They have press offices, briefings, coordinated leaks. When the institution wants a story shaped, it gets shaped. But on this, nothing. No spokesman clarifying that Meghan had prior commitments. No aide floating that the children had school. The silence is total, and in royal circles, total silence is never accidental. What we know is stripped down to its bones. Harry travels, his family does not. A wife who has crossed that Atlantic for every significant occasion, weddings, funerals, the Invictus Games, stays home. Children who have British blood, a British grandfather on the throne, a British great-grandmother's grave they have barely visited, they stay home too. The question that silence refuses to answer is whether this is logistics or something far colder. Whether Harry has looked at what the British government has and has not promised him and quietly decided that the risk calculation does not clear. That calculation did not arrive from nowhere. That calculation began the moment Harry stopped being a working royal and the British state stopped treating his life as a protected asset. When the step back was formalized in early 2020, the security arrangements that had surrounded Harry since childhood were reviewed, revised, and ultimately stripped back. The Royal and VIP Executive Committee, the body that quietly decides who gets armed protection in the UK, concluded that Harry no longer qualified for automatic, taxpayer-funded cover. He was private now. He could fund his own detail. The message was clinical, institutional, and in Harry's view, catastrophically wrong. He challenged it, quietly at first, through the proper channels, the way someone still hoping for a quiet resolution operates. That route closed. So in September 2022, the challenge became public. A high court claim against the Home Office, filed with enough legal weight behind it to signal this was not a gesture. Harry wanted the right to pay for Metropolitan Police protection when in the UK, something the government was blocking on principle. His private American security, the argument went, simply could not replicate what the Met could provide. Local intelligence, coordination with standing units, the institutional architecture that makes a protection detail genuinely effective rather than decorative. The government's position was that this was the wrong mechanism, that private individuals, even former senior royals, could not simply purchase that access. Courts would decide, and while the courts decided, Harry kept coming back. The Queen's Platinum Jubilee in June 2022, the committal service for the Queen in September, then the funeral itself days later, both attended, both navigated through a fog of unresolved protection arrangements, third-party coverage cobbled together, and by most accounts inadequate against the threat level, Harry's own legal filings described as real and present. Each visit was a negotiation, some of it conducted through lawyers, some through intermediaries, none of it resolved. He was in effect returning to a country where the question of who would protect him had no settled answer. The High Court ruled against him in February 2023. Harry lost the case. He appealed. In April 2024, the appeal failed too. Every formal mechanism he had used to argue that the British state owed him a coherent duty of protection had now been closed off, one by one, with the quiet efficiency of an institution that had already made up its mind. What followed was not acceptance. Harry made clear he remained unwilling to bring his family to the UK without what he considered adequate security. He said it in interviews. He said it through his lawyers' public statements. He said it in terms specific enough that the implication was impossible to miss, that Archie and Lilibet, who held British citizenship and whose grandfather was king, were being kept away from the country because their father did not trust that country to keep them safe. That is where the thread begins to pull tight. Not in 2020. Not in the abstract politics of the step back, but here, in the specific, documented, legally tested failure of Harry to secure what he considered a baseline guarantee every subsequent absence, every trip he makes alone, every occasion Meghan and the children do not board that plane, connects back to this point. The question is whether this visit is different, or whether it confirms exactly what Harry refused to say out loud. Because to understand what the stripping of that protection actually meant, you have to understand what replaced it. The answer essentially was nothing or nothing sufficient. Harry could hire private security. He could coordinate, request, negotiate. What he could not do was compel. And that distinction, mundane as it sounds in the language of bureaucratic process, is the one that changed everything. The decision itself came down through the Executive Committee for the Protection of Royals, REVEC, in early 2020, folded into the broader machinery of the Sandringham Summit, and the weeks that followed. When Harry and Meghan stepped back from frontline duties, the protection went with them. The official logic was clean enough. Publicly funded police protection is tied to public role, and they had relinquished the role, neat, procedurally defensible, and, in Harry's view, an act of institutional abandonment dressed up as policy. He challenged it. That much is documented. The legal case Harry brought against the Home Office was not a celebrity grievance dressed in silk. It was a formal argument that REVEC's framework was being applied to him inconsistently, that the risk calculus used to assess his family's exposure had been shaped by factors beyond pure security assessment. He lost. The courts found REVEC's process lawful. But losing the legal argument did not dissolve the underlying risk. It simply confirmed that the risk was now his alone to manage. That is the moment the arithmetic changed. Before 2020, a visit to Britain was logistically complex, but not a personal gamble. After it, every trip required Harry to make a private calculation, measuring threat level against available private resource, weighing what his own team could provide against what only the Metropolitan Police could. And for Harry, who had watched his mother die in a tunnel in Paris, that calculation was never abstract. It was visceral. It had a face. His legal team argued at various points that the protection framework left him unable to visit the UK safely without bespoke arrangements that should not fall to a private individual to fund or arrange. The Home Office's position was that adequate alternatives existed. These were not small differences of administrative opinion. They were irreconcilable positions about what safe meant and who bore the cost of getting it wrong. The stripping of protection did not only affect Harry. That is the part that sharpens into something else entirely. It affected every calculation made about bringing his children into British territory. Archie and Lilibet are not protected individuals. They are not senior royals. They travel with their parents under whatever security their parents can arrange, which means that when Harry concluded the provision was inadequate, that conclusion applied to them first. So every solo trip he has made since, and there have been several, to see his father during illness, to receive his ESPY award virtually, to attend the coronation, to sit at a bedside, has carried an unspoken footnote. He came, they did not. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. And the question of whether it is deliberate is precisely what this visit, and its particular guest list, is forcing into the open. The pattern being too consistent to be coincidental is one thing. The pattern having a name is another. Meghan is not in the UK, Archie is not in the UK, Lilibet is not in the UK. And Harry did not say that out loud. He did not issue a statement explaining their absence, did not cite security as the reason, did not give the Home Office the dignity of a direct accusation. He simply boarded a plane alone, again, and in doing so, he said everything. This is the answer the legal proceedings were always circling but could never quite force into the open. The courts gave him a partial victory, acknowledged the process had flaws, and then returned him to a protection framework that still, in his assessment, falls short. He accepted that verdict in public and rejected it in private. The acceptance lives in the legal filings. The rejection lives in the empty seats beside him on every flight back to Britain. What makes this particular visit so damaging for the institution is not the sympathy Harry generates by appearing at his father's bedside. It is what his family's absence implies about the institution itself. Because the Home Office does not set protection policy for private individuals in a vacuum. It sets it as an extension of what the Crown is willing to guarantee. And if the conclusion Harry has reached, quietly, consistently, across multiple trips over multiple years, is that the guarantee is insufficient for a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, then the embarrassment does not stop with a legal dispute. It metastasises into something the palace cannot easily contain. A father's judgment about his children's safety is not a policy disagreement. It is a verdict, and it is now, by virtue of the pattern being impossible to ignore, a public one. The Home Office will not respond to this directly. They never do. Their position remains what it has always been, that Harry's security is assessed on the same basis as any other non-working royal, that the framework is proportionate and lawful, that the decision is operational and therefore not subject to public debate, all of which is technically defensible. none of which addresses the fact that Harry keeps arriving without his family, and the British public is starting to do the arithmetic. There are people within palace-adjacent circles who have argued quietly that Harry's security argument was always political, a vehicle for grievance rather than a genuine assessment of risk. That line has grown considerably harder to maintain. It was easier to dismiss when the absence of Meghan and the children could be explained by scheduling or exhaustion or the general complexity of transatlantic travel with small children. It becomes something else entirely when the pattern extends across a father's cancer diagnosis, a coronation, an awards ceremony, a vigil. These are not optional events for a man who insists he loves his country and his family. The calculation being made about who attends them is not logistical. It is existential. And that calculation points directly back to the stripping of protection in 2020 as the original wound that has never properly closed. Harry did not leave the UK and then decide it was unsafe. He left, lost his protection, attempted to negotiate an alternative, was refused, litigated, partially won, and still arrived at the same conclusion. The sequence matters. This is not a man manufacturing a grievance to justify an exit he had already made. This is a man who has spent 4 years trying to find a version of return that works and has not found one. Every solo flight is evidence of that failure. Not his failure, necessarily. The failure of the system to produce an answer he can live with. The cruelest irony is that the institution most damaged by this is not the Home Office. It is the monarchy itself, because the image now calcified into public consciousness is not a rebellious duke in California making documentary films about his own trauma. It is a son who flew to London to sit with his dying father, and did it alone, because he did not believe his children would be safe enough to come with him. That image does not invite outrage. It invites something quieter and harder to shift. It invites the question of what kind of institution produces that choice, and whether it is comfortable with the answer. Some institutions should be made to sit with discomfort. Occasionally, that is the only thing that produces change. If this story has stayed with you, if the gap between the official version and the reality it papers over is something you want to keep examining, then subscribing to this channel is the simplest way to stay in the room. We cover these stories the way they deserve to be covered. We'll be back with more.